If it's cold, clear, moving fast, and tastes good, it's safe to drink. That's the myth. I've heard some version of that sentence my whole life. From other off-gridders, from guys I worked with in the woods, from family around a campfire passing a canteen without a second thought. Honestly, from myself more times than I'd like to admit. Said with the same casual confidence you'd use to state something everybody already knows to be true. It's the single most common belief I run into in this whole space, and it is completely, dangerously wrong. Today I'm busting it properly, with the actual science behind why, and I'm going to be honest about my own water system while I do it. Because I'm not exempt from this myth just because I make videos about off-grid living. And pretending otherwise would make the rest of this video a lot less honest than I want it to be. Let's get into it. If you're new here, hit subscribe, because I get into this kind of real, tested outdoor knowledge pretty regularly. Here's the myth in full. Fast-moving water can't hold on to bacteria and parasites the way stagnant water can. Cold water is naturally cleaner than warm water, another piece of folk wisdom that sounds intuitive but doesn't actually hold up against how these pathogens behave. If it looks clear and tastes fine, whatever might be in it clearly isn't hurting anybody. Because you'd be able to tell. And if a water source has been used for years, decades even, without anybody getting sick, that's proof it's safe. A piece of logic that sounds so reasonable most people never think to question it at all. Every single piece of that is either flat wrong or dangerously incomplete. And I want to walk through why one at a time. Because I think understanding the actual mechanism matters a lot more than just being told to distrust your gut on this one. Especially for anybody whose gut instincts about the outdoors have generally served them well everywhere else. Which makes this particular blind spot even easier to fall into than it would be for somebody with no outdoor experience at all. Start with the idea that moving water is inherently safer. There's a tiny grain of truth buried in there. Fast water dilutes things and doesn't let bacteria concentrate the way a stagnant pond does. But that grain of truth has convinced a lot of people that fast water is categorically safe. And that's just not how this works. Taking a real but limited effect and stretching it into a blanket guarantee it was never able to support in the first place. Experts estimate that at least 90% of surface water in the United States, including remote wilderness areas most people would consider pristine, carries the protozoa Giardia and Cryptosporidium. 90%. That's not a fringe risk you get unlucky with once in a while. That's close to the baseline condition of natural water in this country, moving or not, whether it's a raging spring snowmelt creek or a slow meandering river miles from the nearest road. And that number alone should be enough to make anybody rethink the confidence they've been putting in appearances. Giardia's actually got a nickname worth knowing. Beaver fever. Because beavers turn out to be one of the more common carriers. Along with deer, elk, birds, pretty much any warm-blooded animal that spends time near water and does what animals do near water. Which is to say, exactly what you'd expect an animal to do without any concern for who might be filling a bottle downstream an hour later. None of that requires agriculture or human development anywhere nearby. A stream running through land that's never seen a fence post or a cow in its entire history can still be loaded with Giardia cysts. Because the wildlife alone is more than enough to keep the cycle going indefinitely. Generation after generation of animals doing their business upstream of wherever you happen to be filling a bottle. A cycle that's been running long before anybody built a cabin or ran a pipe anywhere near it. And one that has absolutely no reason to stop just because a family's been quietly benefiting from that pipe for 7 decades. When symptoms do show up, they're not usually anything dramatic enough to send most people to a doctor demanding answers either. Which is part of why this myth survives as long as it does. Cramping, diarrhea, bloating, fatigue. The kind of thing that's genuinely miserable for a few days, but also easy to write off as a stomach bug you picked up somewhere, anywhere, rather than the specific water you drank a week and a half ago on a trip you've mostly already forgotten the details of. The exact vagueness of the symptoms working against ever tracing them back to their actual source. Giardiasis in particular doesn't go away on its own either. It actually requires an actual course of treatment from a doctor to fully clear. Which means somebody who never makes that connection back to the water can end up carrying it around a lot longer than they need to, still feeling off weeks later and never quite putting the pieces together, cycling through the same low-grade misery without ever finding a doctor willing to test specifically for the thing they never thought to mention drinking in the first place. Comment down below if you've ever drunk straight from a stream or spring without treating it. Because I want to know how common this actually still is among people who spend real time outdoors, myself included, for more years than I'd like to admit. And I'm curious whether that changes at all once people actually see the numbers instead of just going on gut feeling, or whether the habit's too ingrained by now to shift just from a video. Now the part about looking clear and tasting fine, meaning it's safe. This is maybe the most dangerous piece of the whole myth, because it sounds so reasonable on its face. The same kind of common sense that usually serves you well out here, failing you completely in this one specific case. Giardia and Cryptosporidium are microscopic. You are never, under any circumstances, going to see them, taste them, or smell them in a glass of water, no matter how good your senses are or how much outdoor experience you've got, no matter how many years you've spent reading water and terrain for a living. Infected water looks, tastes, and smells exactly like clean water, every single time. Which means your senses are giving you zero actual information about the one thing that matters most. A complete blind spot dressed up as reliable intuition. And there's genuinely nothing you can train yourself to notice differently. No amount of experience closes that particular gap. It genuinely only takes a single Giardia organism to start an infection in some cases. And the symptoms don't even show up right away, sometimes taking a week or two to develop, which is exactly long enough for most people to never connect the illness back to that one stream they drank from on a hike 2 weekends ago, chalking it up instead to something they ate or a bug going around. Here's the piece I think is the most dangerous of all, though. And it's the one I have to be honest about myself, sitting here making a video calling out other people's assumptions. The idea that a water source is safe because it's always been fine. Because nobody's gotten sick off it in 70 years. Because it's been reliable for generations, passed down as settled fact the same way any family tradition gets passed down. Questioned less each time it's repeated instead of more. Until eventually nobody in the family can even remember the last time anybody actually thought to question it at all. That's not evidence of safety. That's evidence of luck holding, and those are not the same thing, no matter how many years the streak's been running or how confidently everybody in the family repeats it around the dinner table. I have to be straight with you here, because I've built more than one video around the gravity water system that's been running off the creek up the hill from my place for 70 years. That system has never been tested. Not once, not by my grandfather, not by me, not by anybody in between. Across 7 decades and at least 2 generations of us drinking straight out of that pipe without a second thought. It's worked. In the sense that nobody in my family has gotten seriously sick off it that I know of, for 70 years. And I've been talking about that system on this channel like its track record proves something, leaning on that 70-year number as if it were a certification instead of just an absence of a bad outcome so far. Treating the length of the streak itself as the argument instead of ever once treating it as the open question it actually is. And doing the research for this video made me realize that's exactly the myth I'm trying to bust, coming out of my own mouth, on my own channel, about my own water. Here's what actually would tell you something, and even this isn't a permanent guarantee, which is a distinction worth sitting with for a second instead of rushing past. A water test only tells you the water was safe on the specific day it was sampled. Contamination isn't a constant steady state, it's an event. An animal dies upstream, right in or near the water, and stays there decomposing for however long it takes somebody to find it, if anybody ever does. A heavy rain washes fresh contamination into the system that wasn't there the week before, carrying whatever's built up on the ground for miles in every direction, straight down into the same channel you're drawing from. A beaver decides to relocate to a spot it's never used before. Exactly the kind of thing that's happened to my own family's pipe more than once over the years. Just for a different reason than water quality at the time. Disrupting the physical system without anybody thinking to wonder what else might have changed along with it. Any of those things can turn a water source from clean to contaminated overnight, and a test from 3 years ago, or 30, tells you nothing about right now. About this particular week, this particular rain event, this particular animal that happened to wander through. No matter how thorough or expensive that original test happened to be at the time it was taken. 70 years without anybody getting sick could genuinely mean the source has stayed unusually clean that whole time. Isolated headwaters, no upstream development. Good luck with the wildlife patterns never quite lining up wrong. The kind of favorable circumstances that are entirely real, but that nobody can actually verify just by looking at a stretch of clear, cold water running downhill, no matter how many decades that water's been running clear and cold in exactly the same way. Or it could mean everybody who ever drank from it got mild cases they chalked up to something else. A stomach bug. Something they ate. Never once connecting it back to the water, because the timing never quite lined up obviously enough to make anybody suspicious. A few uncomfortable days every so often that just got absorbed into the normal background noise of being occasionally under the weather. Never rising to the level of an actual mystery anybody felt compelled to solve. I don't actually know which one it's been, and after making this video, I don't think I get to keep assuming the good version without ever checking. So here's what I'm actually going to do. And I think it's the honest way to end a video about busting this myth, instead of just telling you all to distrust your own systems while quietly trusting mine. I'm getting that creek water tested. Properly, a real lab, checking for bacteria and the protozoa specifically. Not just a quick field strip that only catches some of what matters. I'll let you know what comes back, good or bad, because I think showing you the actual result matters a lot more than just telling you I'm confident it'll be fine. I'll admit there's a part of me that's a little nervous about this, which is exactly the tell that I already knew, somewhere underneath the confident 70-year framing, that this was worth checking a lot sooner than now. That nervousness itself being about the most honest piece of evidence I could offer you, that I hadn't fully believed my own talking points as much as I let on. If it comes back clean, that's genuinely good news. And I'll say so plainly instead of downplaying it or acting like the test itself was somehow unnecessary in hindsight. If it doesn't, I'll say that plainly too, and I'll walk you through whatever I end up doing about it. Whether that's adding filtration at the point of use, treating it seasonally, or something else entirely depending on what the actual results show up as. Adjusting the whole approach based on real data instead of the assumption I've apparently been running on for most of my life. While we're busting myths, there's a second one worth clearing up. Because it comes up constantly in the comments whenever I mention boiling water as a backup option, and I think it's just as widespread as the moving water myth, even though it points in the opposite direction. A lot of people believe you need to boil water for 10, even 20 minutes to make it safe, treating longer boiling as some kind of extra insurance policy. That's also a myth. And it's actually been officially corrected more than once, because outdated advice kept getting copied from one guide to the next without anybody checking the original source. One outdated recommendation from decades ago just quietly repeating itself through newer publications that never bothered to verify it against current research. Each new writer trusting the last one instead of going back to check what the actual studies said. The actual CDC recommendation is a full rolling boil for 1 minute, 3 minutes if you're above 6,500 feet in elevation. That's it. Water hits 212 degrees at sea level, and at that temperature, everything that causes waterborne illness, bacteria, viruses, protozoa, dies essentially on contact. Cell walls and protein structures breaking down well before you'd ever need to stand there watching a pot for 20 minutes. Even at the summit of Mount Everest, where water boils at a much lower temperature because of the altitude, it's still hot enough to kill pathogens in under a minute. Boiling longer doesn't make it safer. In some cases, it can actually make things worse, since extended boiling concentrates whatever's already in the water and can even increase certain chemical byproducts if the water's chlorinated to begin with. One study finding a meaningful jump in a group of compounds called trihalomethanes after just 5 extra minutes of boiling treated water. Compounds that carry their own long-term health concerns and that nobody's actually trying to add more of by leaving a pot on the stove longer than it needs to be. Which makes the whole 10-minute habit not just unnecessary, but genuinely counterproductive in exactly the cases where somebody thought they were being extra careful. That leads into something boiling can't touch at all, which matters if you're dealing with a source you're worried about beyond just bacteria and parasites. Boiling handles every biological threat in water. Full stop. But it does nothing for chemical contamination, heavy metals, pesticide runoff, industrial byproducts. None of that boils away, no matter how long you leave the pot on the heat. If your water source sits anywhere near old mining ground, agricultural spraying, or anything industrial upstream, boiling alone isn't the full answer. And that's a separate problem requiring actual filtration or lab testing to even know if it's present in the first place, since none of those contaminants announce themselves through taste or smell any more than the biological threats do, hiding in exactly the same blind spot your senses already fail you on. Filters have their own gap worth knowing about too. And it's one that trips up a lot of people who think buying any filter off the shelf automatically covers every threat. Most portable filters are rated by pore size, and anything rated around half a micron or smaller will catch bacteria and the protozoan cysts like Giardia and Cryptosporidium just fine, physically straining them out the same way a fine screen catches sediment. A purely mechanical process that doesn't care what the organism is made of, only how big it happens to be. But most standard filters aren't small enough to catch viruses, which are smaller than bacteria by a wide margin. Small enough to slip straight through pores that stop everything else. If viral contamination is a real concern for your situation, camping somewhere with a lot of other people upstream, for instance, or anywhere human waste might realistically be entering the water instead of just wildlife. A distinction worth actually thinking through rather than assuming away. You need either a purifier built specifically to handle that smaller scale, or a chemical treatment like chlorine dioxide used alongside filtration, since neither one alone covers every category of threat on its own. And combining methods is really the only way to close every gap at once instead of just trading one blind spot for another, patching the exact hole each individual method happens to have on its own. I want to be clear that none of this means natural water sources are some kind of constant death trap, because that's not the honest takeaway either. And I don't want to swing this into fear-mongering just to make a dramatic video out of it, scaring people away from something that's genuinely been a viable, reasonable choice for millions of people for as long as people have existed. People drink from wells and springs and gravity systems all over this country every single day without incident. And the vast majority of exposures never turn into anything worse than a couple of uncomfortable days. The kind of odds that feel a lot more comfortable when you're the one drinking than when you actually sit down and look at what you're relying on to keep those odds in your favor. What I'm actually arguing against is the specific reasoning that gets people there. Clear plus moving plus always been fine equals safe. That reasoning is broken even when the conclusion happens to be right. And a broken reasoning process eventually catches up with you. On the one day, the conditions upstream happen to be different than they've been every other day before it. The one day an animal died in the wrong spot, or a storm washed something new into the system nobody had accounted for, arriving with no warning and no reason to expect it based on every day that came before. I think about this the same way I've talked about luck on this channel before. A theme that keeps coming back around no matter what specific topic I'm actually covering that week. Getting away with something for a long stretch doesn't mean you've beaten it. Sometimes it just means the dice haven't landed wrong yet. And assuming a long streak is proof of safety is exactly the kind of thinking that eventually meets the one day it doesn't hold. Whether we're talking about water or anything else you've been trusting, purely because it hasn't failed you yet. The exact same logical trap, regardless of what specific thing you happen to be applying it to. I'd rather know for certain than keep writing 70 years of assumption, and I think that's true whether we're talking about water or anything else out here that seems to leave you alone right up until the day it doesn't. Quietly building up exposure the whole time without ever announcing that it's happening. I'll do a proper follow-up once those test results come back, whatever they say. Because I think that's the only honest way to close out a video that started by calling out other people's assumptions, and it would feel pretty hollow to bust this myth for all of you, and then quietly never mention what my own results actually showed. Letting this whole video be the last anybody ever hears about it either way. For now, if you've got a water source you've been trusting because it's always been fine, that's not evidence, that's just an unbroken streak. And streaks end. Usually without any warning at all before they do. The exact same way mine could have ended on any given day over the last 7 decades, without anybody in my family ever knowing it was even a possibility worth worrying about. Get it tested. It's a lot cheaper than finding out the hard way which version of 70 years you've actually been living in. And it's a lot cheaper than a hospital visit too, if it comes down to it. A small enough cost that there's really no honest excuse left for putting it off any longer than I already have. I'm Cole Ashford. Thank you for listening.